Sometimes, the decisions that seem inconsequential end up shaping everything. When I agreed to go to that party with my friends, I thought it would just be another Saturday night. Another opportunity to stand awkwardly at the sidelines, half-heartedly nursing a drink, and waiting for the clock to tell me I could politely leave. But that night was different. The air was charged with the end-of-summer restlessness that hung over campus. People were eager to escape their routines, to cling to that fleeting sense of freedom before exams and the pressure of winter took over. I was lost in thought, standing by the back door, keeping my distance from the crowd when I noticed him. He was there, in the corner of the room, his eyes trained on the floor, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. There was something different about him, a certain darkness, like he was more observer than participant. His clothes were all black, blending into the shadows that seemed to cling to him as if they were part of his aura. I couldn't understand it, but even from across the room, I felt his presence like a steady hum in my bones. People spoke about him, Dylan. Rumors floated through the student body, snippets of information shared in hushed whispers. He was bad news, they'd say, and someone to avoid. But no one seemed to know exactly why. Just that his past was shadowed and he kept to himself. Watching him, I felt drawn. Not in a romantic, swooning way, but in a deeper, almost gravitational way that I couldn't explain. It was as if he embodied some intangible thing I'd been missing. Against my better judgment, I watched him for the rest of the night. He rarely looked up. And when he did, it was only to cast an almost dismissive glance around the room before returning to his own world. I told myself it was just idle curiosity, that it didn't mean anything, and that I'd probably never see him again after tonight. But even as I left the party, his image lingered, etched in my memory with a strange permanence. That night, lying in bed, I found myself replaying that moment over and over, wondering who he was and why I felt such a pull toward him. I could have let it go, could have brushed it off as a passing curiosity. But deep down, I knew that something had shifted. My life, as predictable as it was, had veered off course in ways I didn't yet understand. And though I didn't know it then, this was the beginning of a journey that would change me in ways I could have never imagined. In the days that followed, I started noticing Dylan everywhere. I saw him across the quad, standing outside the coffee shop, or sitting alone on a bench, lost in thought. Each time, our eyes would meet for a brief moment before he'd look away, as if uninterested. It felt as though fate or something more inexplicable was throwing us together. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But part of me knew that this was no accident. My friends were the first to notice my distraction. During our lunches or study sessions, I'd find myself scanning the crowd, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. I barely paid attention to our conversations, my thoughts always drifting to the enigma he represented. Finally, one of my friends confronted me about it. "You're not thinking about Dylan, are you?" she asked, her tone dripping with concern. I brushed it off, laughing, insisting I was just curious. But she didn't seem convinced. She leaned in, lowering her voice as though we were discussing something forbidden. "Listen, I know he seems interesting," she said cautiously. "But trust me, he's trouble. I've heard things about his past. He's got issues. Just stay away." She gave me a pointed look, the kind meant to convey caution. And, rationally, I understood where she was coming from. I knew I should be wary. But hearing her words only made me more curious. I wanted to know why he was so feared, why he seemed untouchable. Days turned into weeks, and my interest in Dylan only grew stronger. I began to seek out the places I thought he'd be. I'd walk through the library's shadowy aisles or linger around the campus cafe, hoping to see him. Every encounter, every passing glance only fueled my intrigue, deepening the connection that felt as unavoidable as gravity. And each time our eyes met, even for that fleeting moment, I felt a thrill and inexplicable sense of being alive. There were moments when he'd catch me looking, and his gaze would linger just a second too long. I'd feel my heart race, half expecting him to say something, to make the first move. But he never did. He was like a puzzle piece that didn't fit, an unanswered question that left me hungry for more. And though I couldn't explain it, I sensed that he felt the same pull, that he, too, was trapped in this silent, magnetic draw that neither of us could ignore. One evening, as I was leaving the library after a long study session, I noticed a shadowed figure near the entrance. My heart skipped, recognizing him instantly. Dylan was leaning against the wall, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance. He looked almost ethereal under the dim lights, like he was part of the night itself. I slowed my pace, unsure of whether to approach or slip away unnoticed. But before I could decide, he looked up, and our eyes met. His gaze was intense, piercing through the darkness between us. Without saying a word, he pushed off the wall and walked toward me, his steps slow, almost measured. My heart pounded. And for a moment, I wondered if I should be afraid. But as he drew closer, I felt a strange calm wash over me. A sense that whatever happened next was meant to be. He didn't say a word as he handed me a slip of paper, his eyes never leaving mine. I looked down, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. There was an address written in messy handwriting, a place I didn't recognize. Somewhere on the outskirts of town. I looked up to ask him what it meant. But he was already walking away, disappearing into the night without a single glance back. That night, I lay awake, clutching the paper, my mind racing. The address felt like an invitation. A dare. A challenge to step into his world. I wanted to know what it meant. Why he'd given it to me. And what awaited me there. But as much as I wanted to go, a part of me hesitated. There was a thrill to the unknown. But there was also fear, the kind that warned me of the dangers hidden in the darkness. For hours, I weighed my options, battling between curiosity and caution. I knew that by going, I'd be crossing a line I could never uncross. Stepping into a world where the rules were different. Where I couldn't rely on anyone but myself. But as dawn approached, I made my decision. Gripping the paper tightly, I resolved to go. To see where this path would lead me. Little did I know. That decision would alter the course of my life in ways I couldn't begin to fathom. I arrived at the address just after sunset. The sky painted with hues of fading orange and deepening blue. The place wasn't what I expected. Tucked on the outskirts of town, it was a secluded park, almost hidden by a dense line of trees that stood like silent sentinels. The park felt strangely isolated. Abandoned. As though it belonged to another time or world entirely. Dylan was there. Waiting by an old bench under a canopy of tall oaks. He didn't look up as I approached. His gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the horizon. My footsteps crunched softly on the gravel path. The only sound breaking the eerie silence that seemed to envelop us. When I reached him, he gestured for me to sit. We were still silent. And I could feel the weight of unspoken words lingering between us. Like ghosts waiting to be acknowledged. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he began to speak. His voice was low. Barely a whisper. As if he was sharing a confession meant for no one's ears but mine. He talked about small things at first. Surface-level observations. Giving me glimpses of who he was. Piece by piece. I listened intently. Savoring every detail. Feeling as though I was peeling back the layers of a locked box. But just as quickly as he opened up, he would retreat. Pulling his words back into the shadows as though he feared revealing too much. The more we spoke, the more I realized that his life was woven with threads of sadness and loss. There was a weight in his voice. An undercurrent of something unresolved. And it made me feel both intrigued and sympathetic. I could sense a vast darkness within him, a past he was trying to outrun. Mistakes he was haunted by. It was a glimpse. Brief and fragmented. But it was enough to make me want to understand him. To know what he was hiding beneath the surface. As the night deepened, we sat in a comfortable silence. And I felt closer to him than I'd ever felt to anyone. The unspoken connection between us was undeniable. Like a current running just beneath the surface. And for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. A quiet certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be. When I finally left, I carried that peace with me. Wrapped around me like a warm blanket. I couldn't explain it. But I knew that my life had taken a turn. And there was no going back. I was drawn into his world. Caught in a pull I couldn't escape. And I had no desire to resist. Over the next few weeks, Dylan and I continued to meet in secluded places, quiet parks. Empty fields. Shadowed corners of the campus where no one would find us. Each encounter brought a new layer of mystery. A fresh glimpse into the secrets he guarded so fiercely. He would talk about his childhood. About places he'd lived. People he'd known. And the regrets that seemed to follow him like shadows. One evening, as we sat by the edge of a pond under a sky scattered with stars, he spoke of his family. His voice heavy with an emotion I couldn't place. He talked about loss. About mistakes that had driven a wedge between him and the people he cared about. His words were cryptic, leaving much to my imagination. But they hinted at a life filled with hardships and sacrifices. I found myself feeling both protective and curious. Wanting to ease his pain while also hungering for more pieces of his story. I wanted to know everything about him. To understand what had shaped him into the person he was. And though he never gave me the whole story, each new detail made him feel more real. More human. My friends, however, were growing increasingly worried. They noticed my distance. The way I'd drift off mid-conversation. My thoughts constantly elsewhere. They warned me. Again and again. To stay away from him. To focus on myself and let him be. But their words only fueled my desire to understand him better. Every warning felt like a challenge. A push that drove me even deeper into his world. I knew I was losing myself in him. But I couldn't stop. It was as though he'd become a part of me. A vital piece of my life that I couldn't abandon. Even if I tried. I told myself that I could handle it. That I was strong enough to weather whatever secrets he kept. But deep down, I knew I was walking a dangerous line. One that could shatter everything if I wasn't careful. As my relationship with Dylan deepened, so did the distance between me and my friends. They were more vocal now. Their warnings more urgent. They'd heard stories vague, unsettling rumors about his past. Whispers of things he'd been involved in. Incidents that had earned him his reputation. They begged me to stop seeing him. To cut ties before I got hurt. But I couldn't listen. I felt that I knew him in a way they couldn't understand. That I saw a side of him they refused to acknowledge. In my mind, he wasn't the monster they made him out to be. He was simply Dylan. Troubled. Yes. But human. Vulnerable in ways that resonated with me. I believed that he was more than the sum of his past. That he was capable of change. One evening, after another confrontation with my friends, I found myself questioning everything. Their words echoed in my mind, sowing seeds of doubt and fear. For the first time, I wondered if I was being reckless. If I was risking too much for a person I barely knew. But even as those doubts crept in, I felt a stubborn determination rise within me. I knew that I was walking a precarious path. But I also knew that I couldn't turn back. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized that I was willing to face the consequences. No matter how high the cost. I was in too deep. Entangled in a web of emotions that I couldn't untangle. And though I feared what lay ahead, I was determined to see it through. To follow this path to its end. Wherever it might lead. The turning point came on a chilly autumn night. As we sat by the lake under a sky heavy with clouds. Dylan was quiet. More withdrawn than usual. His gaze fixed on the dark water. I could feel the tension radiating off him. A heaviness that seemed to weigh down his every word. After a long silence, he began to speak. His voice barely a whisper. He told me things I'd never expected, mistakes he'd made. Moments of weakness that had spiraled out of control. Choices he regretted deeply. He talked about people he'd hurt. Bridges he'd burned. And the scars he carried as a result. Listening to him, I felt a mixture of sadness and fear. I could sense the depth of his remorse. The pain that had etched itself into his soul. But there was also a part of me that felt uneasy. A small voice in the back of my mind that warned me of the darkness he carried. For the first time, I understood why people had warned me about him. Why they saw him as a threat. He wasn't a villain. But he was broken in ways that I couldn't ignore. And yet, despite everything he told me, I couldn't bring myself to leave. His vulnerability only made me feel more connected to him. More determined to be there for him. As the night wore on, I realized that I was no longer just intrigued by him. I was bound to him. Caught in a connection that went beyond reason or logic. I knew that he was dangerous. That he carried a darkness I might never fully understand. But I also knew that I couldn't walk away, not now. Not when he needed me most. That night, as we sat in the shadows, I made a silent promise to myself. I would stay with him. No matter what. For as long as he needed me. I would be his anchor. His refuge. The one person who saw him for who he truly was. And though I didn't know it then, that promise would lead me down a path darker and more treacherous than I could ever have imagined. Each encounter with Dylan felt like stepping further into his world. A world shrouded in secrecy and shadow. We would meet in the most unexpected places, abandoned buildings. Forgotten corners of the town. Places where no one would think to look. With every secret he shared, I felt myself getting more tangled in his life. Like a thread wound too tightly around something heavy. Unable to break free. I began to notice small changes within myself. I was more alert. More aware of my surroundings. As if I'd adopted his own guarded nature. I was growing more distant from my friends. And even though I tried to stay connected, there was an unbridgeable gap between us now. They couldn't understand what I was going through. And, to be honest, I didn't want them to. My life was now filled with secrets. Parts of myself that I kept locked away from everyone except Dylan. One night, after a long evening of wandering through the town with him, I realized just how much he had become a part of me. It was as though he'd cast a spell on my life. One that colored every moment. Every thought. I found myself checking my phone constantly. Hoping for a message from him. My heart raced at the thought of seeing him again. Feeling his presence beside me. The silent reassurance of his companionship. But with each meeting, I also felt a growing sense of dread. There was something inevitable about our connection. A storm gathering in the distance that neither of us could escape. Part of me wanted to pull back. To reclaim the life I'd left behind. But another part, a stronger, more desperate part, wanted to stay. To see where this path would lead. No matter the cost. I was in too deep. And I knew it. But the pull was too strong to resist. And I found myself surrendering to it. Letting it sweep me away. Even as it led me further into the darkness. As time went on, Dylan's mood grew darker. His presence more elusive. He would disappear for days without a word. leaving me in a state of restless anticipation. I tried to focus on my studies, to reconnect with my friends. But my mind was constantly elsewhere, haunted by thoughts of him. I'd lie awake at night, wondering where he was, what he was doing, and whether he was safe. My life had become a waiting game, each moment spent on edge, wondering when I'd see him again. One night, after nearly a week of silence, I finally saw him again. We met at a secluded park, hidden by towering trees and dense shadows. He looked different, tired, worn, as though he was carrying a weight that was slowly crushing him. He didn't speak at first, his gaze fixed on the ground, his jaw clenched in silent frustration. I could feel the tension radiating off him, a barely contained storm threatening to break. And in that moment, I realized that he was pulling away, distancing himself in a way that felt both deliberate and painful. It was as though he was preparing me for something, bracing me for a goodbye he couldn't bring himself to say. My heart ached, a hollow emptiness spreading through my chest. I wanted to reach out, to hold on to him, to assure him that I was here, that I wouldn't leave. But something held me back, a fear, a sense of finality that I couldn't ignore. I knew that if I tried to hold on, it would only push him further away. As the night wore on, he finally spoke, his voice low and hollow. "You don't need to wait for me," he said, his words cutting through me like a knife. "I'm not someone you should be wasting your time on." I wanted to argue, to tell him that he was worth every second, every moment of uncertainty. But his expression stopped me, the pain in his eyes telling me more than words ever could. He was slipping away, retreating into a place I couldn't reach. And no matter how much I wanted to follow, I knew I couldn't. This was his battle, his burden to bear. And all I could do was watch as he disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone in the cold, silent night. Days turned into weeks. And still, I heard nothing from Dylan. It was as though he'd vanished from the world, leaving no trace behind. I tried to find him, wandering the places we'd been, hoping for some sign, some clue that he was still around. But each place was empty, each memory a haunting reminder of what I'd lost. My friends noticed the change in me, the way I seemed to drift through life like a ghost. They tried to comfort me, to bring me back to the world I'd left behind. But I was too far gone. My life felt hollow, devoid of the thrill and mystery that Dylan had brought into it. I'd built my world around him. And now that he was gone, I was left with nothing but the echoes of our time together. I began to wonder if he'd ever truly been real, if he'd simply been a figment of my imagination, a dream that had dissolved into the morning light. But the memories were too vivid, the emotions too raw. He'd been real, and he'd left a mark on my soul, a scar that would never fade. As the days stretched on, I forced myself to move forward, to let go of the life I'd built around him. I tried to rebuild my connections with my friends, to find joy in the things I'd once loved. But there was a part of me that remained haunted, a part that would always linger in the places we'd been, waiting for him to return. In the months that followed, I began to piece my life back together, though the process was slow and painful. I threw myself into my studies, focusing on my future, trying to rebuild the life I'd abandoned. My friends rallied around me, their presence a comforting reminder that I wasn't alone, even if I felt like a stranger in my own life. Yet, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memories of him, the moments we'd shared, the secrets he'd entrusted to me. His presence lingered, like a ghost haunting the edges of my mind, a constant reminder of the life I'd left behind. I missed him, not just the person he was, but the way he made me feel, the thrill and mystery he'd brought into my world. Slowly, I learned to live with the memories, to accept them as a part of my story. I began to see them not as a burden, but as a chapter in my life, a lesson that had shaped me in ways I couldn't yet understand. I was different now, changed by the experience. And though I missed him, I knew that I was stronger because of it. I found solace in the knowledge that I'd known him, that I'd been a part of his life, even if only for a brief moment. And in a strange way, I felt at peace, knowing that he was out there somewhere, carrying a piece of me with him, just as I carried a piece of him in my heart. Years passed, and the memories of Dylan became softer, less painful, like a distant echo of a time long gone. I'd moved on, built a new life for myself. But he was still there, a quiet presence in the back of my mind. He was a part of me now, woven into the fabric of my story, a reminder of a time when I'd taken a chance on the unknown, on a person who'd changed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Looking back, I realized that my time with Dylan had taught me invaluable lessons, not just about him, but about myself. He'd shown me the beauty of vulnerability, the strength it took to trust someone completely, even when the outcome was uncertain. He'd taught me to embrace the unknown, to let go of my fears, and to live in the moment, even if that moment was fleeting. I no longer felt the ache of loss, the hollow emptiness that had once consumed me. Instead, I felt gratitude for the memories. For the lessons. For the way he'd opened my eyes to a world beyond my own. He'd been a chapter in my life. A moment of intense beauty and sadness. And though that chapter had ended, it had left me stronger. More resilient. More alive. In the end, I realized that taking a chance on him had been one of the most reckless things I'd ever done. But also the most meaningful. He'd shown me a part of myself I hadn't known existed. A part that was braver. More adventurous. More willing to take risks. And though I'd never see him again, I knew that he'd be with me. Always. A ghost lingering in the corners of my heart. A reminder of a love that had defied reason. That had changed me forever.